You are listening to the Fresh Take Network.
All right, so now we move into Loki. Andy has limited time, so Andy, go.
I mean, I've thought about a couple things that you
We
and I were
don't want a
talking about,
Nexus
Josh.
split off.
Right? We got to keep this going.
Yeah.
Obviously, I haven't been on for a couple weeks now, so I mean, um, to me, this is definitely the best of the three shows. Really well paced, moved it along great. There was no boner at the end.
Oh man, should always be a boner.
There should always be a boner in a story. Disney doesn't do those types of movies. Um, we were talking, Josh. We said, how come they don't talk about the reveal at the end that it's why don't they call him Kang by name? And I think the reality is they've basically sort of merged two characters at the end of this from the comics, and it's a version of the He Who Remains and Immortus. So if from the comics, Immortus is a Kang that the timekeepers basically bring forward and say, hey, we need you to take care of everybody else. And if you agree to do that, we'll make you immortal. So Immortus basically comes along and his role is to take care of all the other Kangs. So in this, they talk about that basically that's what he's doing, right? He's providing a buffer and he's keeping the timeline moving very smoothly so that you don't have all these other, they're talking about Loki variants, but in reality, his role was to eliminate Kang variants. So I feel like that's why when you get to the end, he's never called Kang by name. He references the Conqueror, which is another variant of himself. They references that he's a jerk, which is very typical. They also never mention him as being Franklin Richards, which I think to a certain extent, I don't know if they will ever reference him that way. And part of that is just because obviously he's a gender bent version of what Kang really was. And if they gender bend him, it would also mean that they would have to gender bend Mr. Fantastic. So I think there's some reasons behind some of that. But I do really feel like in doing the research here this morning, that's really what this character is it's a version of Immortus and He Who Remains. And basically what He Who Remains is he's a timekeeper that exists at the very end of that timeline. And he is brought back to the start of the next timeline to basically set the TVA up again. So I think that's what his role is. And that's why having the two of them sort of merge together makes a ton of sense. And I think helps to explain why he's at the end. And he's like, hey, you'll see me again if you kill me. And it's him saying, hey, I know how this game goes if you do in fact kill me. I know all the other versions of me that are going to show up. You probably don't want that to happen. But I'm kind of tired of this gig, so I leave it up to you. Either you guys take on my role or you're going to kill me and the timeline is going to go crazy. And the reason that you had the multiversal war from a TVA perspective has nothing to do with the Thanoses or the Lokis or any of that. It has to do with all the versions of Kang that exists. And it's kind of the plus and the minus of this character being brought into the MCU is, you and I, Josh, we watch a lot of Comics Explained, and even there, Rob talks about it that he's a guy who's been reading and doing research on comics for the last 35 years, and even he is confused at times by the Kang stories and all the versions. I mean, there's a council of Kangs in the comics, which is basically like the United Nations of different variants of Kangs and all the things that they do in from ancient Egypt to 1,000 years from now, and they all have totally different, desires and agendas. So it is an interesting character for them to bring in.
But Andy,
I mentioned this. Yep.
Sorry, I just couldn't, because I mentioned to you, it reminds me a lot of, like, because the Rick and Morty guy, one of the writers, Rick and Morty's on this, and like in Rick and Morty, there is the main Rick, there's the C-137 Rick, so and then there's a council of Ricks, right? Is there like a main Kane?
There is a version of Kang that version from the 31st century, who becomes Kang the Conqueror. And that is sort of the main version, and sort of the one that is the most consistent throughout the.
So that's why he kind of throws
timeline.
away the Conqueror, because there's different Kanes, but there's one specific Kane, the Conqueror.
Right, and I think that the one that you'll get in Ant-Man and Ant-Man Quantumania, I think that's the version that you're going to get. I mentioned this to you, and in terms of my my comic book reading time, I was a huge fan all the way through to the last Secret Wars, and the last Secret Wars really opened the multiverse up super, super wide. And a lot of the stories that came after that, I really started to struggle.
That's how we got Miles, isn't it?
Yep. I struggled with the idea of having like 18 versions of the same character, and they were all slightly different. And if you killed this one, don't worry, there's 17 more that can fill that gap. And when you talk about, we talked about it on the Black Widow movie, that the consequences of how powerful characters are and how it moves the story forward. My big concern is, and I trust Kevin Feige to be able to move the whole process forward, but when you start to get into true multiverse and as kicked the door open as you now have, I worry that you're going to lose a lot of the casual comic book fan, the people who aren't like me, who aren't like super sweaty nerdy, who are going to be like, I can't get behind the fact that every time somebody dies, I don't really need to worry, because they're going to pluck somebody out of another version of the multiverse whenever it suits them. And that to me is the biggest fear of going down this path. And if you have the multiverse opened at this point, they even referenced it in this episode where they talk about Thanos and, how inconsequential, like, hey, Miss Minute says, hey, we can send you back and you can be the one that kills him. Hey, don't worry about worrying about Infinity Stones, because there's now 30 other versions of Thanos that one of you will win, and we'll just put you into that timeline.
Yeah.
And we haven't even gotten to villains like Galactus or Dr. Doom or Norman Osborn, or people that the consequences of what they can accomplish should be massive. But unfortunately, as soon as you have so many versions of the multiverse open, the consequences of them and the potential, galaxy threat that they could be is really minimized. And I worry that if they go down that path, that, you talk about superhero fatigue, this is a reason why you could potentially really have superhero fatigue for the casual comic book watcher, because they're going to be like, man, I can't follow the fact that there's 6 Gamoras out there all of a sudden, and Tony Stark is dead, but we can bring him back in whenever we want, and the consequences of losing Black Widow. Oh well, if we really want her in another movie, that's okay. Like, if you're doing that for one movie, like one concept like Secret Wars, that's great, and I'm behind that. But if it's something that this is going to be becoming an overarching piece of so many movies, which when you look at Spider-Man No Way Home, that's obviously going to be in there. When you look at Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, it's obviously going to be in there. When you look at Ant-Man and the Wasp and Quantumania, it's obviously going to be in there. How is a movie like Shang-Chi going to have any consequences or any merit or any
even the Eternals, right? Because you and I talked about it off air. Like those Shang-Chi and Eternals were supposed to come out before this. So now, and kind of like you were talking about with Black Widow before, Devan's like, well, what are the stakes? Like, why do I care? So even like, Shang-Chi will be a really fun movie and Eternals is going to be really fun. But now you're gonna be like, why do I care about this? It has nothing to do with the timeline all of a sudden, because that's
Because
the
the way
big
we know it right
overarching-
now. Yeah, the only thing we know, the thing we know now is the only person that really has of any consequence in all of this right now is Scarlet Witch, because she's a Nexus level being. So she
Yeah.
exists through all the timelines.
Yeah.
So she's really now, she's the only character that
She's a one of
actually
one.
matters in any of this.
Yeah.
Right. So that to me, I mean, you know, I do have to run here quickly, but I wanted to give my 2 cents on this. And that to me is really, you know, the elements that I love. Obviously seeing Kang, that's super great. But when you saw the version of the timeline in the background of the castle, and it's, you know, a solid beam of light, and then by the end of it, it's like an arm of veins with all the capillaries in it, and you can't even see the sacred timeline version anymore. And I'm like, man, this is a slippery slope. And I know from as a DC fan, you know, you have, you know, the Infinite Earth saga version of many different timelines all overlapping.
Mm.
And even for me, who's a comic book fan, that story was very difficult for me to follow.
It's a fucked up one. Just don't get me wrong. It's a confusing
and that's my
one.
worry, right? Is this the version that the MCU is going to go now running down, and they're going to embrace this timeline version?
You have the whole Monitor and the Anti-Monitor, and it's all over the place.
Right. So X-Men now aren't going to matter. Doctor Doom is not going to matter. Galactus is not going to matter. If you bring back the Living Tribunal, it's not going to matter. Like all these things that to me should really matter. If you really open up multiverse, the consequences of it all are lost. Again, I trust Kevin Feige, but this is the very first time in my entire MCU fandom where I'm like, this is a bit worrisome for me of where this could go, because I really do see a version of this that for the average comic book movie watcher could really be somebody who's like, none of this stuff makes any sense anymore. Nobody's really dying. None of it actually matters. The whole idea of an integrated universe no longer has the same impact because somebody dies here and we just notch another version of them in here. So that's my 2 cents in all of this.
That's his TED Talk.
There's my TED Talk on Loki and the history and all of that, where it comes from. I'm sorry, guys, that I do have to run.
Okay.
But there you go. I give you something to talk about at least.
Wow.
Peace, Andy. Thank you.
See you guys.
Yeah, so that's there's Andy's thoughts right there, Dev. I'm really, really interested to see your kind of side of everything here.
Well, from a business perspective, it's absolutely ingenious to do something like this. Now that we've been more than 10 years into the franchise, there are people who are we've had untimely passings, people who've lost interest, people whose contracts have run out. As Andy's been talking and giving me more background information, wouldn't it make a lot of sense if Phase 4 was built around branching timelines, getting new and established people in and out of roles, bringing in new people into established roles or new characters, and then the end of Phase 4 is the reversion to a sacred timeline.
Yeah.
So maybe the idea is time travel, sacred timeline, quantum realm is actually a very finite event. By the end of Phase 4, we're going to have one timeline, and all the characters that want to leave or come back are now fixed in one timeline. For example, Chadwick Boseman's untimely passing has left the door open
You beat me to it.
great. So 2 examples that would make a lot of sense, and I'm happy with either one, would be now you have Killmonger from What If be the new Black Panther, so you can bring Michael B into it as a good guy, or you make Shuri the Black Panther. And so in Phase 4, you use that Nexus level event, blah, blah, blah. And so by the end of Phase 4, you have one Black Panther locked in.
You could, they said they want to do it.
Tony,
right now.
and you're right, Tony can come in.
They could recast T'Challa now, because they can say this is T'Challa, and it doesn't have to be Chadwick.
Exactly. So from a business perspective, when you're dealing with people's lives who are locked in for a number of years, it makes a whole lot of sense. And so
you can literally have Tom Cruise or John Hamm be Iron Man and be like, oh, it's Iron Man. but
this
it's
is
a
Iron
different
Man.
universe.
This is Iron Man 1, 2, 3 from
Yeah.
the Upside Down world
Yeah.
or the underwater world or whatever,
Yeah.
which is great. So if you make Kang or the Legion of Kangs or whatever, the big bad for just phase 4, and then you revert back to a normal timeline, but you have brought people in from different timelines, now you can go forward with a whole new diverse cast. You can gender bend characters, you can race bend characters, you can sexuality bend characters, you can make Frog Thor, Beta Ray Bill, and it all will make sense going forward. So I think that this blip in the timeline, like kind of no pun intended, kind of intended, is actually the main obstacle for phase 4, is getting it back on track.
Well, so here's the thing. I agree with Andy in the sense of the consequences, but I feel like everything you said is a very good point, and I think it's a great way to bring in a Spider-Gwen, to bring in a Miles Morales as well, right? To bring in some of those characters that you can't have in those ways. I mean, look, the worst kept secret now, if it wasn't before, is like we are obviously getting all 3 Spider-Man now. Like I'm not even going to be surprised by it. It's like, yeah, okay, we're getting all 3 Spider-Man now, and I'm cool with it. Like the main question for me is like, is Emma Stone Spider-Gwen or not? That's all I'm curious about now.
Well, we know we're getting a Sinister Six of all the Spider-Man villain through the various franchises.
And
We're getting Shocker, Electro,
Sony
Rhino.
comes in here too, right?
Yep.
And Hugh Jackman could be in here too.
Right? We can get a Fantastic Four with Miles Teller. We can get
No, stop.
But we could.
No, yeah, we could.
Which would it be the worst thing in the world? Not really. Like, I mean, he's going to get a new chance at being a character that people really like. I mean, the movies wasn't that great, but he wasn't a bad part of being Reed Richards, more or less. Like, he was fine. And we talked about consequences in the Black Widow review and consequences about now. And I'm not saying that people have to be, we have to fight the biggest, baddest villain all the time. What I'm talking about is, do these foils and antagonists change people's perspectives or change people's characterizations? So Black Widow facing Dreykov, does it make her a better Black Widow? Not really. Does it change anything about how we think about Black Widow? Not really. It was kind of a Fast and the Furious Marvel movie. We're family because we spent some time together. Okay, whatever. I don't really think Red Guardian was that great of a character because he's a spy who doesn't want to be a spy anymore. Like I would have liked to see actual Red Guardian in the movie, or Red Guardian footage, or news clippings or something like that. Instead, we get kind of a washed up guy who we're supposed to believe is and maybe that's part of the thing is he can say whatever he wants and people have to believe him.
What's funny with that review, with Michaela talking about the cap is like she hasn't seen Loki, and I'm just like, little do you know that maybe.
Oh yeah, and you know what? Her theory about facing whatever cap from whatever version makes so much sense, and I'm actually really excited for that because you're right. He probably, and maybe he does fight Isaiah Bradley, maybe he doesn't, maybe he finds old Steve Rogers. Who knows? It doesn't matter.
We can get in a young Isaiah Bradley now potentially with this, which I'm super. I'm more optimistic, I guess, because number one, like I said, Crisis in the Infinite Earth. They eventually all just kind of collapse into each other to build one universe, and that's what the CW one has done now. Right. So they're all together, and it's worked out. They've done a good job of building that the correct way. And the comics, it kind of does the same thing. And then Flashpoint had the New 52, and that kind of led to different things. And I think that's kind of what the Secret War side was, the splash everything to Marvel, and that's how you got Miles and Spider-Gwen and all that kind of stuff, right? And as we've seen with. I don't know about the consequences part as much, because as we've seen with Into the Spider-Verse, there is consequences, right? Those Spider-Man still do die, right? Like the Chris Pine Spider-Man did die, right? So you needed, the Jake Johnson one. He's in a different realm, but there was still the consequence of that Spider-Man dying. It wasn't just like, oh, it's over. So I think the one reason I'm excited about it is because I trust Kevin Feige. No matter, like, he's given us full reason to trust him. He's not a Kathleen Kennedy situation here, right? You have a full reason to trust him. And then we've seen what Spider-Verse did and how good the storytelling can be with the multiverse layer with everything. And we know that there's these other outside kind of crazy situations that you can add, and it makes sense now. All of a sudden, this is why Deadpool's here. This is why if you
Right.
want Hugh Jackman, if you want Halle Berry back for some reason, right?
Yep.
You can explain if this is
As
why
a
Vincent-
business decision, it makes so much sense to do a multiverse. I'm not gonna be one of those people that's like, oh, we'll just be, we skipped all these other good guys and now we're fighting like the ultimate bad guy. There's always a way to make people threatening in certain ways. I just hope that the motivations for characters make sense. And so one of the things I wanted to ask Andy was, why does he tire of being the timeline guardian? I'm actually not sure. I just love to hear input as to why people think that is. And I like the idea of, he's like, well, I'm the good Kang, you should see what the bad Kangs are like. That's going to be really interesting to see multiple versions of this villain. But we can skip Galactus, because Galactus can be the next, if we redivert the timeline to one singularity after the end of phase 4 or 5 or whatever it works out to be, we can bring a Galactus because there's only one timeline. So there's only one Galactus, or there was a Galactus from a different version who came in and or whatever. The show itself is, we haven't really talked about the show at all, the actual episode itself.
Yeah.
Other than the fact that we had quite a few reveals. Is it Jonathan Majors who plays Kang?
Yeah.
Fantastic manic performance. Kind of reminded me of like a bit of Hannibal Lecter at times, a bit of like Silva from Bond. He's someone that I was really drawn to magnetically on the screen. So
First time I've ever seen any performance from him.
Yeah, I'm really impressed by just his kind of charisma. I feel like he could be the kind of person or character who could lure you in and then manipulate you various different ways. At the end of the day, we come back to the same time travel tropes or predetermination tropes as always. Is like, if he's designed every single person to do every single thing the way he wants, what's the point? What's the point in seeing it? What's the point in talking about it? So if the end of the show was just for him bring the two Lokis together, and then you didn't know what's going to happen after that, does that make sense to me?
Well, that's the part I didn't get, is like, why did you want those Lokis together? Just to kill you because you knew what it was going to do? Like, that's the part I don't get.
Yeah, and so I'd love a little bit more, and maybe that's where Andy kind of comes in and gives us a little bit more explanation. That's where I'm really kind of confused, is to be like, okay, so we worked up to the fact that he's been pulling the strings to get them there, and then
but you were protecting this. You wanted to have the one secret timeline, but then you don't. But now you don't, and you knew Sylvie was gonna, because you had to assume that Sylvie was gonna go there and be set on revenge, no matter what. So you knew that getting the whatever Kang that is, death was gonna set off this an enormous Nexus event.
Right, which was the point or not the point. I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
So that, to me itself, I'm not saying it's lazy. I'm not saying it doesn't make any sense. I'm just confused as to where we're going to go from here. And I don't really want to see a lot of revisionist history. And I think Marvel's been really guilty of it lately, where especially Black Widow's an example of like, oh, like we're adding a lot of character development to Natasha because we gave her a movie, and it's going to make everything make way more sense later on. And it's like, Natasha's like the least interesting part. Like I don't need to like kind of know about her background. Now I would have loved to, and I would have loved to see a Natasha movie 5 years ago. I just don't think it would have been that storyline.
My main problem with that movie, and I didn't mention it, and we'll go back to Loki, is I'm just sick of super soldiers. I'm just sick of it. Like, that's all. Like, I've had Winter Soldier with it. Cool, that was great, right? And then there's a little bit of it in Civil War. Okay. And then we have a little bit.
Well, we're getting someone in Civil War who's specifically trying to stop the creation of super soldiers.
But we just hear about super soldiers. We hear about them. And then we have Falcon Winter Soldier where they're building more again. And we have different stuff with soldiers. And then now we have this one where there's like different super soldiers. Yeah. And we have the Dora Milaje, who are super assassins as well.
They're not like super soldiers. They're just elite. And
I
that's
guess, like,
hard
how
is
many-
because I think
how many?
the Marvel version of like an elite soldier is almost a super soldier. You're right.
Yeah, I just like how many different female assassins do I need and super soldiers? Like if it was just like if you have the Dormalagus as the assassins and you have those super soldiers, cool, I'm with it.
Widows.
Yeah, I'm with it. But now it's just like
Yeah.
it the problem that I have with Widow is it just felt like I've been here before. Where I've done this.
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
done
We're
this,
taking
I've
down
been
a
there.
secret agency we're taking it down a secret agency from the inside, and by going to a secret base, like that was it's essentially this is Winter Soldier, the Russian version of Winter Soldier, the movie.
Pretty much, yeah, pretty much.
And but to go back to Loki, I would have I like Sylvie as a character. I wish that, and I guess she was true to form. Like she did talk about everything she wanted to do, and then she ended up doing it.
She did.
But I wish that changed Loki and Sylvie, sorry, actually had discussed things. Like with them sitting there in the room with Kang, like other than them fighting, like I actually don't think the fight was needed really.
No.
And then
Loki tried to stop it. Sylvie was the one that wanted to do it.
Yeah. And then to send Loki back into a new version of the TVA that didn't recognize him, that was pretty interesting. So now it opens up a couple questions as to the Loki that ends up in Endgame. Is that a variant, a different timeline version, or is that him going back and sacrificing himself? Although, which I think now that we've seen the Loki show for 6 episodes, I don't want it to be this Loki. I really don't.
Like I said in Rick and Morty, where there's, and this is my only reference point of it,
Yeah.
but like there's the C-137 Rick, who is the main Rick, who is the Rickest Rick.
Yeah.
I think that was the Lokiest Loki. And I think that time that we've been having is the main timeline. So when they go back in time, they obviously branched off into another side of time right there, which I look, the Chosen One tried to make this all explain of the branches of time and everything like that. And now I feel in some ways I'm even more confused with Endgame's time travel.
Exactly. Because like, is it meant to be on purpose? Did it create variations?
Yeah.
But no, they were meant to do that the whole time. So I'm not going to say like, oh, the MCU's in trouble, because in reality, what we're doing is we're trusting them to take us on a new ride that we haven't seen before, by combining stories or by changing things in the stories. So I'm okay with new interpretations. I just want it to be a little more considered than just like, well, this now makes this movie way better. When in reality, like I'm kind of over like old Thor. I'm kind of over Captain America. I want to see people who actually have decisions to make.
Well, and how does the TV, like there's a season 2 of this.
Yeah.
Awesome. I think we're all cool with that. But like, now I'm like, okay, well, is that happening before Doctor Strange and before, like, it's obviously happening before Spider-Man. So we're going to Spider-Man, and is this, we're assuming that there is going to be some multiverse stuff in Spider-Man, right? With Jamie Foxx being in it.
Yep.
And this is
Alfred Molina.
And Alfred Molina. So this is the way to bridge that Sony universe into this universe. So I'm like, are we going to hint about what the TVA is? Is Doctor Strange going to know what the TVA is and how it's all breaking down? And it's almost kind of messed up that you're not going to have Kane now as any consequence in either Spider-Man or in Doctor Strange now, because of what has been transpired now in here. Like, I think season 2 will happen before Ant-Man, but this is the problem that I do have. It's just like, I mean, like I said, Shang-Chi will be fun, Eternals will be fun, but it's just like, there was this whole thing in the arch of the Eternals trailer about like, we've stayed out of Earth's situations for so long. It's like, but
Earth,
they're not,
Earth's like this. Yeah. Why Earth?
Is now,
Why
but
not?
also now is like they're not multiple Eternals as well now. So like, you guys are such a small fraction. Who gives a fuck about you, right? Like, yeah, oh, yeah, we're celestial beings and stuff. It's like, okay, well, great, like that's cool. Like, but I think in many ways, they can't help what happened during the pandemic and whatnot, but
No.
that Loki was supposed to come out after those movies. And I think we look at those movies so much differently afterwards, right? Like there's a much different discussion with it. So I guess I'm going to go in with different expectations about Shang-Chi, but I almost wonder if I go in the expectations now that I went in kind of with Black Widow, like, well, none of this really matters right now because how does this matter on the time? Everything now will be questioned about the timeline. That's the main Marvel side of how we were building to Thanos and the Infinity Stones. Now everything comes back to the timeline.
I'm not so worried about expectations and how how being out of order will change what I'm hoping for and timeline stuff. I just want to judge it as if it's a good movie that, and consequences can be small, but consequences should have consequences later on. And I think part of the problem with Black Widow is it doesn't, I mean, after 10 appearances in various movies, Scarlett Johansson's give a very well-rounded performance, a very humanized performance of Black Widow. And so her sacrifice, I don't think her sacrifice makes it any better or worse. Just because I saw the fact that she has like an adopted family, like it kind of was like, whatever. So these movies, Shang-Chi and Eternals and things like that, I'm more so just going to judge on the fact that 2 hours unrelated, is Shang-Chi, is he going to be a character that I'm going to be invested in because I want to see what happens to him? Not because of timeline stuff, just because is he a convincing performance?
Yeah, and I'm also just interested. Like, is the Mandarin in this because of the timeline now? Is there a different Mandarin because
the real
that?
Mandarin? Yeah,
the real Mandarin.
Or did they make it like was Trevor just Trevoring people, and then he actually is the Mandarin?
Yeah, that's what I'm interested.
I mean, at this point in time, what are we, like 6 years past Iron Man 3?
Yeah,
or whatever it is. I don't really care about the Mandarin anymore.
No,
unfortunately, like we've moved past it.
One of the most heartbreaking things in this was the end when Owen Wilson doesn't know who Loki is.
I know.
I was like, no.
The memeable version of of Mobius is really fun. There's a lot of great pictures and fan art of him on the internet with Loki and blah blah blah.
The Luka jet ski one is my favorite.
Very cute, very poignant. But now I'm just kind of wondering, like, if we're just going to keep resetting Mobius, like, what was the point of even?
I don't know if they reset him. So
not reset him, but I think they went to a different timeline altogether. Okay, so
that's what I was saying, because
I'm almost certain, because the statute of the TVA is that version of Kang, so he's in a different time that has no idea about that Loki.
Because the one before, you had like a scene 3 minutes before when Mobius is talking to the Hunter about something completely different.
Yeah.
And then we go to where Loki is, and I'm like, okay. And that's why I was like, now with the timeline being the way that is there multiple TVAs?
But yeah, that's what I'm wondering about, because it seems like the TVA operates outside of time. So why are there different TVAs?
Mm-hmm.
But
that's what I'm wondering.
Different galaxies, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know. I'm just gonna try to take it as it is.
Yeah. I think the show did a lot to at least ask you a lot of questions, right? It gave us characters in Sylvie that I really enjoyed. I like the Mobius question. Renslayer, we'll kind of see where she goes. Like, I don't know where she's off to. So I'm really happy there's another season of it as well, because it was the Marvel show I enjoyed the most, and it left us with a lot of questions. So the
end quality of the actual show is by far and away the best of the three. And it is very consequential because it opens up the idea of timelines and variants and blah blah blah. And it gave us Sylvie a Sylvie Loki relationship, which I hope ends up happening. The last thing I want to see now is our version of Loki, Lokiest Loki, whatever you want to call him, is him just go back to stabbing people in the back.
Yep.
That's the last thing I want to see. So if we get good Loki for a few movies or a few different shows or whatever, who then ends up sacrificing himself as being a good guy, I think that's a great arc, because you take him from the very beginning of Thor to now, that is a position where he is not the same person as where he ended. And one of my critiques of the Marvel universe is that most of the characters don't really change that much.
Right.
I don't think Captain America is a great, convincing character, and Chris Evans is phenomenal. But at the end of the day, I don't really think Cap did, never really stepped out of his comfort zone that much.
Right. All right. Well, let's get to Joel, and we'll talk about Rick and Morty. And I'm going to give Devan a break from trailers this week, and I'm going to get Joel to talk about trailers this week. So, although, I mean, you did see the What If trailer, and that was fantastic.
Oh, super cool. I have so many questions, and I think that's the kind of multiverse stuff I want to see. It's just kind of questions we'd ask ourselves and just see what it is like for half an hour, and then we move on.
No Steve, no Chris Evans, no Tony, no.
Yeah, that was weird.
What's his name?
Weird
Jr.
Robert. Yeah, but we got everyone else pretty much.
Yeah. There's a clip of Sebastian Stan doing voiceover stuff, but doing grunts, and it's really hilarious. He's like, "Motherfucker!" He's like, "Oh, I guess I can't say that in a Disney property."
I like seeing Chris Evans. I like seeing. I mean, is this Chadwick's last performance?
It's his last performance ever. Yeah,
and it's cool that he's going to be Star-Lord. Like, what a nice little treat for us.
And by the way, I don't think they should recast Black Panther. I just want that to kind of be known, because I know that's obviously a very big conversation that's been had and whatnot. But I will say, like, the opportunity is there now if they choose to do it.
You make it an alternate version of Killmonger, or you make it Shuri, and you have the Queen of Wakanda. That's probably my best case scenario.
All right, Dev, thanks so much for the Bad Batch review and everything else. And let's get to Joel for Rick and Morty and some trailers.